Woodcraft since 1928, providing traditional and modern woodworking tools and supplies to generations of craftsmen. Woodcraft, helping you make wood work.
Oh, hi, come on in. My name is Rick Butz. Welcome to woodcarving. Sometimes it seems that with the hustle and bustle of modern life, we've forgotten one of the more simpler pleasures of just sitting and making something with our hands. And that's what we're going to be doing today. We're going to be making this wood carving of a horse. Now, I've drawn out the outline onto the wood here, and we could whittle this away or cut it out with a coping saw, but a much faster way is to use a 20th century invention, the bandsaw. And that's all there is to it. Now, when I laid out the wood on the pattern here, it may look at first like these legs are real thin and delicate, and to an extent they are. But by controlling how you align the pattern with the wood, you can really make that a lot stronger. Let me show you what I mean here. Here's a pattern of our horse. And on this piece of wood, the grain is going like this, as you can tell by some of these streaks in the wood. Now, if you were to lay out the legs so that the grain was going across them, this would be very fragile. Instead, you lay it out like this, so that the grain is running down the length of the wood. It makes it much stronger. Here I can give you a little simple demonstration of how that works. Here's a piece of wood. It's been cut off the end here, and you can see how the grain is going across it. Now this is very easy to split these fibers of bundles in the grain there. But here's a piece that was cut off from the end, and the grain is running down the length of it. And that's much harder. I mean, that's almost impossible to break just by brute force. With a softwood, it actually works out that the grain going long ways is about 40 times stronger than the cross grain. So it'll make it a lot easier to do your carving. Now the wood that I've used today is butternut wood, and this is an American nut wood that has a very nice grain to it. It's not real hard to carve, and it's soft, almost like pine, but it tends to be just a little stringier. So you want to take your time. But you can see once you get started on it, the beautiful color of the grain here and the figure of the wood. I think that's what makes wood carving such an interesting art form, is every piece of wood that you use is different. And you never really know exactly what you've got until you start cutting into your wood. This cut I'm using here is your basic whittling stroke. And to do that, you just hold the knife in the fingers of your hand, brace the thumb against the edge of the block, and then just close your fingers and draw the knife towards your thumb. Keep your thumb down out of the way, though. If you're just starting out, you might want to take and wrap a Band-Aid or something around your thumb for a little extra insurance. Now, as you rough off the shapes here, you have to be careful about the grain, because in some parts here you're going to be going against the grain, and you're just going to have to sort of feel your way along with a complex shape like this. If it's making nice smooth curls, then you're okay, but if you feel that knife starting to dig in, then stop and turn your piece around and come from a different direction, and that'll avoid any problems. One of the problems you're going to have with this is cutting out this area between the legs here. And that's a fair amount to whittle out, but you can save yourself some trouble just by taking and marking out where you want to cut. About there, I think. Just some rough lines. And then putting it in a vise. And you just take the coping saw, and this is a saw with a very thin, delicate blade stretched in a metal frame. And this allows you to make nice, thin, delicate little cuts in the wood. And we'll just take and cut down those lines. Let's see, a little farther yet. This will help clear away some of this wood inside between the legs here and make your carving a little easier. This is kind of it's one of those classic subjects of wood carving. Horses have been popular all over the world. And you find examples of this type of carving all across America, all throughout Europe. Now I'm going to take and tilt my blade just a little, and there we go. It's a sort of a stubborn piece of wood here. I can turn the blade because it's so thin, and I'm cutting across. Let's see, I almost got that through. I can cut across and cut out most of this piece of wood inside. There, so you can just turn that right around at a right angle. Just there. And that'll save us a bit of time. So you just figure out where to cut on the back legs too, and you can kind of trim out some of the wood there as well. Then it's just a simple matter of coming along here and carving away the excess wood from one of the legs. And cutting away the excess wood on the other. And pretty soon you'll have two legs. This is a pretty wood to carve. Well, anyway, you get the general idea. We'll just cut away this wood here and cut away this piece of wood on the other side here too. And that'll give us both the forelegs in different positions. Now, one of the tips on cutting along the tail here is you can make it a little bit easier if you use a gouge. This is a 10 millimeter V gouge. And it's got two straight sides that come down and form a little bit of a cutting V. And this is a perfectly acceptable tool to use in whittling. And you can take and shape away part of the tail with this. Now this technique I'm using on the tool here, it's not like I'm pushing my whole arm, because that can be kind of dangerous. You don't have control. Instead, I'm bracing my thumb against this and then just moving the knife or the cutting edge of the gouge just a little bit. See, my hand is braced against it, and I'm just moving it with my hand. Basically, I'm just whittling with this gouge. This is a carving technique that they use in Switzerland a lot, although it's not something you see a lot of in this country. And that makes it a little easier to get in there and work out this area down in the crevice. And then you can just take your knife and round that out and just keep repeating the process, and pretty soon you'll have the tail carved clear. When you get done, you're going to have something that looks, well, a little bit like this. And this is the area where we were carving around through there. With a project like this, it's always a good idea to work out your rough shapes first. Get this guy blocked out pretty well. And then start doing the rounding on him. Butternut is one of my favorite woods because it has such a beautiful wood grain to it. And it's, I don't know, the richness of the color and the patterns. You can really see when you're working a piece of wood like this why for centuries people really believed that wood was a magical thing. And wood carvers sort of had a little bit of a magical mystique around them too, because they were the people that controlled and shaped this sort of mystical material. For centuries, people believed that spirits lived in the wood. Of, gnomes and elves and fairies. And there's a lot of legends about people who maybe cut down the wrong tree or something like that and got in a little bit of trouble with powers of the supernatural. As a matter of fact, I remember one of my favorite songs, an old English song about a farmer who went and he planted he was going to make a field, so he cut down the oaks and the beech trees and everything, and it turns out that there was elves that lived in the woods, and they weren't too happy about that, so they figured that as long as this farmer had cut down all their trees, they're just going to move in with him. So anyway, he was sitting there having lunch one evening, and he looked out the window, and here's all these 500 elves coming out of the woods to come to his house. So anyway, he did a couple of magic spells, and I think he made the sign of the cross on the doors, and the elves all took off to another place to live. But it's kind of a funny song. We also have that superstition that people even use now, where let's say something like knock on wood for luck, or in Europe they call it knock wood. And that superstition dates back to when they believed that wood was inhabited by little magical elves or fairies or whatever. And as the story goes, if you were saying something that might be considered a little bit prideful or something, or bragging about your good fortune, these guys in the wood might think, well, this thing seems to be going pretty good for this guy, so we'll throw a little bad luck his way. So you're supposed to knock on wood when you're talking, and that would either fix it so they couldn't hear you because you're making too much noise, or it'd chase them out of the wood. There's myths like that about wood all over the world. This horse I'm using is patterned from a sort of palomino shape, even though I'm using a dark wood for it. And horses, I don't know, they're such beautiful animals. They have such a beautiful shape to them. And a project like this is something that you can really do a lot with. It's something that you can start out if you're just sort of a beginning wood carver. You can take a piece of wood like this and you make just a simple little horsey. But on the other hand, say you've been carving for many years and you're fairly proficient at it, you can still take this very same pattern and go much farther into the subject. You can take and start using a small gouge and detailing the musculature of the horse. And it's kind of tricky because you can not only just show the positions of the muscles, but also, if you're really getting involved in this, you need to know which muscles tense and flex when the weight is put upon them and which muscles are relaxed. So you can really turn this into a masterpiece and a work of art too. That's what's really neat about a project like this. It's something that it can be something for everyone. And there's really no end to it. For doing these finishing cuts along here, I'm going to make sure my knife is absolutely sharp. If you have a very sharp knife, it leaves smooth polished facets in the wood. Whereas if it's dull, it's going to kind of rip this wood up. And that's because so much of this is the end grain. This is where the annual rings of the wood are and where the ends of the cells show. Now, if you have trouble getting a sharp edge on your knife, let me just show you a couple of tricks that might help. First thing you need is a sharpening stone and a strop. This is a sharpening stone I'm using. And this is one that you can just buy at any hardware store. It's got a coarse side and a fine side. I almost never use the coarse side. Then you need some light machine oil. Something like some 3-in-1 is good. And you just take your knife and just rub it back and forth on this fine side of the stone. I usually do it about 10 or 20 times, then I'll flip the knife over and do it about 10 or 20 times on the other side. Anyway, you keep that up until when you run your finger away from the cutting edge, you can feel a little fine burr of metal. And when you can feel that, that's called the wire edge or the burr edge. And when you can feel that, then you've gotten your knife as sharp as this particular stone is going to make it. For some reason, when you're sharpening, as the metal wears away, it forms a very thin edge on your cutting edge. And you have to get rid of that because it'll just sort of fold over and dull your tool as you carve. So I can feel that a little bit. So I'm done with the stone. Now I take out my strop. And this is just a piece of leather fastened down to a chunk of wood. You can take a little buffing compound like Tripoli or Jeweler's Rouge or even silver polish, rub that on the leather, and then just take your knife and stroke it along that leather away from the cutting edge. You're going to want to hold this about the same angle that you did when you were sharpening, which is about 25 degrees up from the stone or the leather. And just keep working this, and eventually this is going to wear away that burr edge, and it'll give you a razor sharp edge. And that's what you need for carving. A sharp edge is actually much safer than a dull one because it takes less force to move the tool through the wood. Also, you have much better control of the tool. It's not as likely to slip around in the wood. One of the ways to check for sharpness is to take and just very lightly rest the knife on the back of one of your fingernails. If you can feel it grip, then the blade is sharp. If it just kind of slides up and down, it is still dull. Now I'm not putting any pressure on that. Look, I'm just holding that very lightly with 2 fingers. It's a very sensitive test, and that'll tell you if your knife is truly razor sharp or not. So, when you have your sharp knife, then you can get on with doing the finishing cuts here, and that'll really bring out the true beauty of the wood. For detailing around the face, we'll want to take and notch down the ears a bit here. And to cut those down, I'm just going to make a little notch on either side. And just kind of work that down. Remember the old woodcarver saying that 3 small chips are better than 1 big one. So don't try to take all this out at once. Now it's kind of tricky getting in there, so I'm going to use a knife that's got a little finer point. I usually have 2 or 3 knives I work with in different shapes, and I find that some places one works better than another, depending on how much of a point I need. Remember, for doing this type of carving, you don't need a real big blade. Something that's an inch or 1.25 inches at the most is really all that you need. Now for detailing the face, you're going to want to take your time just a little bit as you work along here. And it would also help if you had a book or some photographs of a horse in front of you. I used a photograph when I drew out the pattern for this Palomino. But a horse has a very distinctive structure on its head, and it's something that you're going to want to get right, because otherwise it's just not going to look quite right. So it's not a bad idea to take some time and actually get some sketches or some patterns or photographs right there in front of you when you're working. unless you're very familiar with the shape of the animal. When you get done with the face, you'll have something that looks a little bit like this. And to make the eyes, I've just taken the point of the knife and holding in a pencil grip, I've just made a very small incision around the eyes, then taken and very carefully pared away the wood around it so that it makes the shape of the eyeball there. Now for the mouth, I've taken a small V-tool, small little number 12 3mm V-tool, and cut around the mouth there. And that gives us the shape of the mouth. And for the head, the forelock, I've taken the same tool and carved those away, and then just taken my knife and pared away the excess. Same thing with the mane. You can just take the V-tool and make the shape of the hair there, and then carve away what's the extra. Let me show you one of the ways you can do this tool on the tail. This is where you might run into a little bit of a problem because the grain on the tail is going vertically, but we've got a curve here, comes around in sort of an S-curve all the way around. So when you're doing the tail, you'll have to remember that if you feel your tool digging into the wood, then you're going against the grain. I can start out here and make a nice curl, but then you see it starts digging in there. What you have to do is come around from the other side until you meet that, and that takes out your chip. Otherwise, if you keep going from here, it's just going to keep digging in and knock off that whole big chunk. If when you're carving, you do accidentally knock off an ear or say you squeeze too hard and break off one of the legs, don't panic. All you need to do to fix that up is a little bit of glue. And one of the best glues that I could recommend is some 5-minute epoxy. And that just comes in 2 tubes, a resin and a hardener. Mix a drop of each on a piece of paper, and then just mix those together, put those where the thing may have broken, and then put the pieces together, and then just hold them. Now, this glue sets up in about 5 or 10 minutes. And it saves having to clamp it, and after it's cured for a couple of hours, it's actually harder than the wood, and you can just go ahead and carve on that, and there's no problem. So that's our horse, and as you're shaping along there, this is what the tail's going to look like. For doing these little parts around the leg, it's going to be tricky to carve, so use a little piece of sandpaper and just kind of work that around there. And it'll help the shape. Now normally with a carving, I like to leave the tool marks, but because this wood is so beautiful, it's got such a nice grain to it, that what I've done is sanded it down part way. And that makes it a little easier to see the beauty of the wood. For a finish, I used something called French polish on this horse. And that is something that you can make up yourself. It's made of equal parts of shellac, wood alcohol, and boiled linseed oil. I'll just take and pour maybe 1/4 of an inch of each of these ingredients in this jar, shake it up, and you have French polish. It gets its name from the fact that it's the basic formula that the French cabinet makers used, in the 17th and 18th century for creating these beautiful finishes on these nice Renaissance pieces of furniture. And to use it, you just take and moisten a little on a rag, and then just take and wipe on a very light coat. Then just let it dry, and it's all done. As it dries, a little bit of the shine will go away and leave you with a nice matte finish. The other thing I'd like to mention about this finish is that the shellac, once it's mixed up, the shellac only has a shelf life of about 6 months. So when you mix it up, you may want to remember that if you go back 6 months later, you might want to mix up a fresh batch, because once you mix it, it doesn't keep forever. You can tell if it's going bad just by taking and wiping a little piece on a little piece of wood. If it doesn't dry, if it still is sticky after a couple of hours, then you need to mix up some more. So that's all there is to it. Very nice, easy, beautiful finish. Keep it sealed up too, because that alcohol evaporates off pretty quickly. Now I'd like to show you just a couple of other carvings that you can do with this style. This one here is a fawn that I carved, and I used exactly the same techniques that we use today with a horse. Although with this guy, because he's kind of shaggy, I'd taken a wood burning pen and textured in some of the fur on it and then painted it. And I'll be showing you how to use this tool and technique a little bit later. This other carving is one of a German shepherd, and this is carved out of a large block of basswood. And in this case, I've kept the piece fastened right to the block. I've just drilled holes out from underneath, cut that away with a coping saw, and then carved it. Now on something large like this, you can actually use your gouges to shape it instead of a knife, and then just use the knife for the details. But the nice thing about this is it's a project that you can do just about anything with, and it's a lot of fun. I think you'll enjoy it. Next time, I'd like to show you how to make an early American eagle. We'll be visiting the Shelburne Museum in Vermont, taking a look at their collection. Then we'll come back and we'll make this eagle up from one of the same patterns that John Bellamy used back in the 1800s. So, it's really been great talking with you, and thanks for dropping by. Until next week, this is Rick Butz wishing you happy carving.
You can continue to learn wood carving with Rick Butz with his book, How to Carve Wood. This 224-page book of challenging exercises and projects is full of detailed instructions. Lessons include whittling, wildlife carving, and relief carving. To order your copy, call 1-800-950-9648.
Woodcraft, for all your woodworking needs. Tools, supplies, lumber, project plans, and educational workshops. With a mail order catalog and stores nationwide. Woodcraft, helping you make wood work.